Shame thrives in secrecy, and that truth is one of the most powerful realities we often ignore in our daily lives. When we hide our struggles and refuse to give them words, they grow heavier and stronger inside us. Silence feeds shame because it convinces us we are the only ones who feel broken, flawed, or unworthy. The longer we keep our shame in the dark, the more it takes control of how we see ourselves. It becomes a shadow that shapes our decisions, our relationships, and our sense of self-worth. Think about the times you felt deeply embarrassed, humiliated, or guilty, but chose not to share it with anyone. That silence likely made the memory even more painful because you had to carry it alone. Shame loves isolation because it knows that when we remain disconnected, we are weaker. In those moments, we build walls around ourselves, and those walls become prisons. We start to believe that we must keep hiding because no one could possibly understand what we are going through. But here is the paradox: shame loses its strength the moment we bring it into the light. The act of naming it out loud, even if it is just to ourselves, begins to loosen its grip. Words are powerful because they expose what thrives in silence. Once spoken, shame can no longer lurk in the shadows unseen. Acknowledgement opens the door for empathy, and empathy is shame's greatest enemy. When we realize that our story is not unique in its pain, the weight begins to lift. This does not mean we should pour our shame into spaces that are unsafe or with people who cannot hold it with compassion. Not everyone has earned the right to hear our story, and that is important to remember. Sharing shame in the wrong environment can actually deepen the wound. But when we find someone who listens without judgment, someone who responds with kindness instead of criticism, the healing begins. The secrecy that fed the shame loses its nourishment and starts to wither away. In every culture and community, there are unspoken rules that teach us to stay quiet about our pain. We are taught to appear strong, to hide our struggles, to never admit weakness. These lessons might be meant to protect us, but in reality, they suffocate us. Pretending to be perfect creates distance between us and others because no one can relate to perfection. Vulnerability is the bridge that connects us to each other, and it is impossible without openness. By staying silent, we deny ourselves the very connection we need most. The human heart craves belonging, and shame convinces us that belonging is impossible. It tells us, if people knew the truth about you, they would leave. That lie keeps us locked away from the acceptance that could actually set us free. But when we dare to speak, when we dare to let someone see us as we truly are, something incredible happens. Instead of rejection, we often find love and understanding. The act of opening up proves that we are not alone, and that is where shame begins to die. Breaking the silence is not about exposing every detail of our pain to the world. It is about refusing to let secrecy control our worth. It is about choosing courage over comfort and light over darkness. Every time we speak truth into a space that once held silence, we take back our power. Shame will always try to convince us to hide, but the truth is that courage grows in the moments we refuse to stay quiet. And every act of courage creates a ripple effect, making it easier for others to step out of silence too. You are not your mistakes, and yet shame constantly whispers the opposite in our minds. It tells us that the errors we've made, the failures we've experienced, and the choices we regret are the sum total of who we are. When we fall into that trap, our identity becomes tied to the worst versions of ourselves. We stop seeing our mistakes as moments and start seeing them as definitions. This is how shame convinces us that we are unworthy of love and belonging. A mistake is something that happens in a moment, but shame stretches that moment into a lifetime. It convinces us that a single wrong choice makes us permanently broken. Imagine if every human being was reduced to their worst day. None of us would ever feel whole. But we are not designed to live under the weight of permanent labels created by temporary failures. Human growth comes from learning, and learning only happens when we allow ourselves to separate who we are from what we have done. Think about how often we speak to ourselves in ways we would never speak to a friend. We tell ourselves, I am a failure, instead of, I failed at this. That small shift in language has massive power over our mindset. One version erases our dignity, while the other gives us room to grow. When we confuse actions with identity, we chain ourselves to the past. But when we remember that our mistakes are experiences, not definitions, we free ourselves to create a different future. Every successful person you admire has a long list of mistakes behind them. They are not defined by their failures, but by the way they rose after them. Mistakes are stepping stones to resilience, but shame tries to paint them as permanent scars. It's not the failure itself that stops us, it's the story we attach to it. When we say, this mistake means I am unworthy, we surrender our potential. But when we say, this mistake taught me something, we reclaim our strength. The danger of believing we are our mistakes is that it kills courage before it even begins. We stop trying new things because we are terrified of confirming the lie that we are failures. Shame keeps us trapped in the comfort zone, convincing us that safety lies in not risking at all. But avoiding risk means avoiding growth, and avoiding growth means avoiding life itself. To live bravely, we must allow mistakes to be part of the journey without letting them define the traveler. Separating identity from mistakes also opens the door for compassion. When we accept that we are not our errors, we learn to extend the same grace to others. We stop defining people by their lowest points and start seeing them as human beings in process. This is how relationships heal and communities strengthen. When we let go of judgment and embrace compassion, we remind each other that no one is beyond redemption. Compassion kills shame because it allows space for both accountability and love. The truth is, we are complex beings with both light and shadow inside us. Mistakes are evidence of our humanity, not proof of our worthlessness. Every time we fall, we are given a chance to rise differently, to choose better, to grow stronger. You are not the worst thing you've done, and you are not the sum of your failures. You are a human being learning in real time, and that truth will always matter more than your shame. Courage means facing shame, and that is one of the most difficult battles we will ever fight. Shame is loud, cruel, and relentless, but courage is the quiet decision to stand up anyway. It is not about erasing the fear or pretending we are unaffected. Courage begins when we admit that shame exists and still choose to move forward. Without this choice, shame will always remain in control of our lives. Many people misunderstand courage, believing it requires fearlessness. But true courage is not the absence of fear. It is walking into the storm even while your knees shake. When shame tells us to hide, courage whispers that we must be seen. Every act of bravery is born out of resistance to shame's lies. When we show up despite feeling unworthy, we weaken shame's grip on our story. Facing shame requires honesty, and honesty feels uncomfortable. It demands that we look directly at the things we try hardest to avoid. Courage is saying, yes, I made mistakes. Yes, I feel unworthy at times, but I refuse to let those feelings silence me. This kind of honesty does not erase pain, but it transforms it. The very act of naming what we fear gives us strength to endure it. It takes courage to tell our stories, especially the parts we would rather bury. Shame convinces us that if people knew the truth, we would be rejected. But when we risk sharing our truth, we often find the opposite: connection, compassion, and understanding. The courage to be seen allows others to see themselves in us. By facing shame, we create space for others to face theirs. There is also courage in refusing to accept shame's false definitions. Courage says, I am not broken. I am not worthless. I am not the sum of my worst days. This resistance is not arrogance, but resilience. It is claiming ownership of our worth, even when shame tells us it has been lost. Courage is not always loud. It can be as simple as choosing to believe in your own dignity. In everyday life, courage against shame looks small but powerful. It looks like speaking up in a meeting when your voice shakes. It looks like admitting when you need help instead of pretending you have it all together. It looks like apologizing sincerely instead of hiding behind pride. Each of these moments is a battle with shame, and every time you choose courage, you reclaim a piece of yourself. Courage means rewriting the story shame tries to tell. It means refusing to stay silent, refusing to shrink, and refusing to surrender to lies about your worth. When we face shame, we begin to dismantle the walls it has built around us. And as those walls fall, we discover that courage was never about winning the battle instantly. It was always about showing up, standing firm, and refusing to let shame decide who we are. Vulnerability breaks shame's power, and that is a truth many of us resist because vulnerability feels unsafe. We are taught from an early age to hide our wounds, to mask our fears, and to protect our hearts at all costs. Shame thrives on this hiding because it convinces us that our flaws make us unlovable. Yet the very thing we fear, being open, is the very thing that sets us free. Vulnerability shines a light into the places shame wants to keep dark. When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we step into the courage of being fully seen. That means admitting our struggles, sharing our truths, and letting go of the illusion of perfection. Shame cannot survive in this environment because it feeds on secrecy, not exposure. The moment we say, "This is my story," we strip shame of its disguise. Vulnerability creates a space where authenticity becomes stronger than fear. It is important to remember that vulnerability is not weakness, but strength. Weakness is hiding and pretending. Strength is showing up as you are. It takes far more bravery to say, "I am struggling," than to act like everything is fine. Shame tells us that vulnerability will lead to rejection, but most often it leads to connection. People are drawn to honesty because it reflects their own hidden truths. Consider the times when someone opened up to you with raw honesty. Chances are you didn't turn away, you leaned closer. Their vulnerability gave you permission to feel your own humanity. This is why vulnerability breaks shame. It transforms isolation into connection. Where shame says, "You are alone," vulnerability proves, "We are in this together." That bond dissolves the lies shame depends on. Of course, vulnerability requires discernment. It is not about sharing every wound with anyone who will listen. Not everyone has earned the right to hear your story, and wisdom means choosing safe spaces for openness. When we share with people who meet us with empathy instead of judgment, vulnerability becomes healing. It allows shame to lose its grip in a setting where compassion replaces criticism. Vulnerability also empowers us to grow. When we admit what we don't know, we open the door to learning. When we confess our fears, we discover resilience we didn't know we had. When we allow ourselves to be imperfect, we give ourselves room to evolve. Shame locks us in place, but vulnerability creates movement. It turns our pain into a path forward instead of a prison cell. In every act of vulnerability, shame's voice grows quieter. Vulnerability reminds us that flaws are not failures, but features of being human. It reminds us that love and belonging are not earned by perfection, but by authenticity. By choosing to show up as we are, we model courage for others who are still hiding. And in that collective courage, shame loses the battlefield it once controlled. Empathy is the antidote to shame because shame cannot survive in an environment where understanding and compassion exist. Shame tells us that if anyone knew our truth, they would reject us. It convinces us that we are unworthy of connection, so we isolate ourselves. But empathy interrupts this cycle by saying, "I see you, I hear you, and you are not alone." In that moment, the power of shame begins to dissolve. When someone meets our pain with empathy instead of judgment, it changes everything. Empathy doesn't demand solutions or quick fixes, it simply offers presence. That presence tells us that our story, no matter how messy, is still worthy of being heard. Shame thrives in silence and judgment, but empathy speaks softly against both. It creates a safe place where healing can begin. The act of empathy requires courage because it means stepping into someone else's experience. It is not about comparing struggles or diminishing pain, but about saying, your pain matters. When someone shows us empathy, they reflect our worth back to us. That reflection weakens the lies shame tries to build in our minds. It reminds us that being human is not a disqualifier for love and belonging. Empathy also helps us reconnect to ourselves. Shame pushes us to believe we are broken beyond repair, but empathy offers acceptance in our imperfection. When we experience compassion from another person, we learn to extend it inward. That self-compassion is one of the greatest tools against shame. It allows us to say, yes, I made mistakes, but I am still worthy of care. It is easy to underestimate the impact of empathy because it looks simple. A kind word, a listening ear, or a gentle presence might feel small, but to someone drowning in shame, it is life-saving. That moment of connection says, you don't have to carry this alone. Shame isolates, but empathy builds bridges back to belonging. The smallest act of kindness can become the spark that brings light to someone's darkest place. Empathy also transforms relationships. When people respond with compassion instead of criticism, trust is built. That trust creates environments where people no longer fear showing up as themselves. In families, workplaces, and communities, empathy is the foundation of healthy connection. Without it, shame festers and erodes bonds. With it, people feel seen, valued, and understood. Every time empathy shows up, shame loses ground. It cannot coexist with the warmth of compassion and the honesty of connection. Where judgment fuels shame, empathy starves it. And when empathy becomes a way of living, it not only heals us, but inspires others to break free from their own shame. This ripple effect proves that empathy is more than kindness. It is a powerful force of liberation. Shame exists everywhere, weaving itself silently into the fabric of our daily lives. It shows up in our homes when parents unknowingly use criticism instead of encouragement. It shows up in schools when children are taught that mistakes define their intelligence. It shows up in workplaces where people hide their struggles for fear of being seen as weak. It even shows up in communities when judgment outweighs compassion. Shame is universal, and because it exists everywhere, it must be addressed everywhere. In families, shame can become a generational cycle. A parent who grew up in an environment of shame may unconsciously pass it down to their children. Words like, "you're a disappointment," or "you'll never be enough," take root deeply in young hearts. Over time, those words become an inner voice that dictates how someone sees themselves. Breaking this cycle requires awareness, compassion, and the courage to raise children with empathy instead of judgment. In schools, shame often hides behind the pressure to succeed. Students are rewarded only when they achieve and punished when they fall short. This creates a culture where asking for help feels dangerous because it might reveal weakness. Instead of learning resilience, students learn to fear failure. The result is not only damaged confidence, but also a distorted view of worth tied only to performance. Education should empower, not diminish, but shame often robs it of that purpose. Workplaces, too, are often breeding grounds for shame. Employees fear making mistakes, speaking up, or challenging authority because shame tells them they will be judged or rejected. Instead of fostering creativity, this fear stifles innovation. Instead of building trust, it builds silence. A culture without empathy forces people to wear masks of perfection, and behind those masks, shame quietly grows. Work should be a place of growth, but without addressing shame, it becomes a place of fear. In communities, shame can take the form of stigma and exclusion. People are labeled based on their struggles, their past, or their differences. Instead of compassion, they receive judgment, which only deepens isolation. Shame convinces people they don't belong, and communities that fail to challenge this lose their sense of unity. True community is built on connection, and connection cannot exist where shame is allowed to dictate who is worthy and who is not. Even in leadership, shame often disguises itself as control. Leaders who use fear, intimidation, or humiliation to command respect are not leading. They are spreading shame. This approach might achieve obedience for a time, but it destroys trust and loyalty. Real leadership requires vulnerability and empathy, not shame and fear. When leaders acknowledge mistakes and allow space for others to do the same, they create cultures where people can thrive without the weight of shame. The presence of shame in every space we occupy proves that it is not a personal issue, but a collective one. We cannot dismiss it as something only individuals must overcome. If shame is left unspoken, it corrodes families, weakens schools, silences workplaces, and divides communities. Addressing it requires courage from everyone: parents, teachers, leaders, and friends. Only when shame is called out in the open can it begin to lose its hold, and only then can environments become places of growth, belonging, and connection. Transformation comes through courage and connection, and that is where the true power against shame is found. Courage alone helps us face our pain, but connection ensures that we don't have to face it in isolation. Shame thrives when we are cut off from others, when we believe that no one could understand our struggles. Connection breaks this illusion and reminds us that being human is a shared experience. When courage meets connection, healing begins to take root. Courage is the spark that ignites transformation because it allows us to stand against shame's lies. It is the choice to say, "I will not let this define me," even when fear tells us otherwise. Without courage, shame convinces us to stay silent and small, trapped within its walls. But every act of bravery, no matter how small, creates a crack in those walls. That first step of courage paves the way for something greater. Connection is the ground where transformation flourishes. When we open ourselves to others and share our stories, we find belonging. That belonging reminds us we are not alone, that our pain does not make us unworthy. In connection, shame's strongest weapon, secrecy, loses its power. The simple act of being understood can feel like liberation, and after years of carrying silent burdens. Transformation is not about erasing the past, but about reclaiming our future. Courage gives us the strength to admit our wounds, while connection helps us heal them. Together, they shift the narrative from "I am broken" to "I am becoming." Shame tries to trap us in a fixed identity, but courage and connection prove that growth is always possible. This shift is the essence of transformation. Consider how relationships change when courage and connection replace shame. Families become safer when parents model vulnerability instead of perfection. Friendships deepen when honesty takes the place of hiding. Workplaces thrive when leaders encourage openness rather than punish mistakes. Every sphere of life is transformed when people choose courage and connection over fear and shame. This transformation also inspires others because courage is contagious. When one person stands up against shame and embraces vulnerability, it gives permission for others to do the same. Connection spreads through empathy, and that shared strength creates movements of change. What begins as a single act of courage in one life can ripple outward to heal communities. Transformation is never just personal, it is collective. In the end, courage and connection work together to rewrite the story that shame tries to tell. Shame says we are alone, but connection says we belong. Shame says we are defined by failure, but courage says we can rise again. Transformation lives in this tension where bravery meets love and honesty meets acceptance. It is in this space that people not only heal, but also discover the strength to live boldly and authentically, free from the chains of shame.